The desert is a god that never blinks. It watches all who cross its back, keeping their names in dunes and their bones in silence. Beneath the relentless sun of the Sahara, the men of Kanem-Bornu once rode tall in the saddle, their spears like bronze prayers pointed toward the horizon. Theirs was an empire that breathed in dust and exhaled fear, a kingdom that mastered the emptiness. Long before maps drew borders, before cities glittered on the coast, Kanem-Bornu ruled the heart of Africa. Its riders were not born of comfort, but of heat and hunger. Their mothers sang lullabies in tents made of camel hide. Their fathers taught them to ride before they could read. For them, a horse was not just an animal. It was a brother, a living relic of survival in a world that offered none. They were men who prayed, standing on their saddles, who measured courage not by gold but by sheer endurance. They drank the wind and swallowed faith whole. They rode not just for glory, but for the Sultanate, for the unshakable belief that no sandstorm could ever conquer a determined will. Yet, for all their legend, the desert cavalry lived in a state of constant torment. Sweat turned to salt beneath their heavy armor. Water was rationed more tightly than breath itself. And the horizon never came closer, no matter how far or how fast they rode. Every hoofprint left in the sand was another heartbeat nearer to utter exhaustion. The price of their empire was paid in every cracked lip, every sore muscle, every moment of doubt swallowed under the vast, uncaring sky. This was a life of extreme discipline, where survival was a daily, hard-won victory. Let's pause for a moment. The fire crackles gently as the night breathes around us. Imagine a Canary cavalryman, clad in deep indigo robes, his horse adorned with protective leather armor. They are riding across endless golden dunes as the first light of dawn paints the sky. This was their world, beautiful but brutal. A canvas of sublime emptiness that demanded everything from those who dared to cross it. The empire's capital first, at Njimi, later at Ngazagamo, was a city whose power was drawn directly from scarcity. Its rulers believed that faith could tame the desert and that men, molded by unwavering discipline, could command the wind itself. So they built their armies not from conscripts forced into service, but from true believers. The Quran was read aloud before every battle. Powder horns were filled beside prayer mats. Spears were sharpened and then blessed with holy verses. This fusion of military might and spiritual devotion was the bedrock of their strength. From these riders came tales so grand that it seemed the desert itself bowed to Kanem. Legends claimed their horses could smell raiders from miles away, that their captains could march for days without shade, and that their spirits, forged in the furnace of the Sahara, never knew fear. But myths have a way of forgetting the gritty reality, the painful sores hidden beneath the saddles, the gnawing hunger that cracked their lips, the silent tears shed under indigo veils. The glory of the empire was built on the anonymous suffering of these men. This story will take us deep into that forgotten pain, into the sweat and sacrifice behind the empire's legendary glory. We'll journey into the minds of men who, in their quietest moments, prayed not to win battles, but to simply survive and return home. Let's pause again for a moment. The fire hums softly now, and the stars tremble like diamonds scattered across the immense, dark canvas above us. Picture a nighttime desert encampment. We see the silhouettes of horses against a moonlit horizon, their shapes dark and still. Small fires flicker near rows of sleeping riders, wrapped in their cloaks against the cold desert night. This was their brief respite, a fragile peace before another day of sun and sand. I'm so glad you've joined us for this journey. If you find value in these forgotten histories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue to bring these incredible stories to light. Now, let's ride into the past. You are under baobab skies, and the story of the riders of Kanem-Bornu begins now. The dawn comes slow in the Sahara, as though the sun hesitates before touching such a cruel and unforgiving earth. In the pre-dawn quiet, the riders of the Kanem-Bornu wake in silence. Their camp is a low hum of creaking leather and shallow, rhythmic breaths. Before the first word is spoken, they pray. Before the first bite of food is taken, they check the horses. Here, in this vast emptiness, faith comes first, flesh later. It is the unwritten law of the desert, the first lesson a rider learns. Their mounts are restless, stamping impatiently in the cool morning sand. These are not just any horses. They are sleek, powerful creatures, bred not for explosive speed, but for something far more valuable in this landscape: endurance. The men move with practiced efficiency, tightening girths, brushing sand from coarse manes with their bare hands, and whispering short, personal blessings in a mix of Kanuri and Arabic. They treat their horses not as tools, but as partners in survival. A commander, his face a mask of stoic resolve, signals with a single, sharp gesture of his hand. There are no horns, no drums. The desert does not allow for such noise. It is a jealous keeper of silence, and it remembers every echo, every sound that dares to disturb its peace. They ride out in a disciplined formation, their silhouettes stark against the slowly brightening east. Somewhere over that horizon, a distant oasis waits like a mirage of hope, a promise of life. But between them and that precious water lies a battlefield of invisible enemies. Not just the threat of raiders hiding behind a dune, but the constant, gnawing presence of thirst, and the slow, insidious decay of a man's will to continue. Their leader, a man hardened by this very landscape, carries a sword that once belonged to his grandfather, a veteran of 30 campaigns. He keeps it wrapped in fine cloth, not just to protect the steel from the sand's corrosive touch, but to guard its memory, its legacy, from the harsh reality of the present. It is a tangible link to a past filled with glory and survival, a reminder of the bloodline he represents. The wind begins to rise, a low, mournful sigh that quickly grows into a persistent whisper. It drags fine particles of sand into every fold of their robes, under their veils, into their eyes and mouths. Soon, it will be too strong to speak over, so they conserve their words, each one a precious commodity. Communication becomes a language of glances and gestures. Every man knows his place in the line, his duty to the man beside him. As they ride, their thoughts wander homeward, to the wives who watch from the entrances of their tents, their faces etched with a familiar worry. To the children learning prayers by heart, the next generation of an empire built on faith and resilience. A lone vulture circles high overhead, a dark speck against the pale sky. It is a patient observer, a constant reminder of the desert's nature. The horses whinny in a chorus of unease, their instincts more acute than any man's. They can smell the scent of what lies ahead, the scent of a land that always hungers first. The desert does not discriminate. It consumes all who falter. By noon, the heat is no longer a discomfort. It is a physical assault, a violent, suffocating presence. The horizon trembles like molten glass, distorting the world into a shimmering, uncertain dreamscape. The men drink from their leather flasks, each drop a treasure measured out with extreme care. They chew on hard-dried dates, their jaws working against the grit of sand that has coated everything. They can taste the salt of their own sweat on their lips. In this endless expanse, there are no trees, no landmarks to guide them only The ever-shifting dunes and the memory of direction, a compass etched into their minds. Suddenly, their captain raises a hand. The entire column halts as one, a testament to their incredible discipline. Something glitters far ahead, a faint line, but it's moving. The tension is immediate and palpable. Raiders, perhaps, or Tuareg scouts on a patrol of their own. The men instinctively form a wedge, the classic formation of attack. Horses snort, their heads twitching, ears pricked forward. The polished tips of their spears are lowered, catching the brutal sunlight. A silent, deadly readiness settles over the group. The sun hangs directly overhead, a merciless judge in a court of sand and sky. The wind, for a moment, dies down, and as the air clears, the threat reveals itself. It was nothing, only a mirage, a trick of the light and heat, a phantom army born from their own anxieties. The spears are raised, the formation relaxes, but the fear remains. It lingers in the air, a cold knot in their stomachs. The true terror of this land is not a swift death in battle, but the quiet horror of absence. The knowledge that you could simply disappear into the sand, your story ending without a final word, never to be spoken of again. At dusk, they finally reach it. A well. Its rope is frayed and worn, but it still holds the promise of life, a lifeline to the world beneath the sand. They dismount, their movements stiff from the long day in the saddle. Each man drinks in silence, the simple act of quenching his thirst, a profound, almost spiritual experience. There is no laughter, no chatter. The relief is too deep for celebration. They use handfuls of the precious, muddy water to wash the caked sand and sweat from their horses, tending to their partners before themselves. Then, as the last light of day fades, they kneel together, their bodies facing Mecca, their shadows stretch long and thin across the cooling earth. A line of faithful men united in a single, silent act of devotion. And as the first stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the night sky, they all know. They know that tomorrow will be the same. It will be a day of thirst, of silence, of obedience. This is the life they have chosen, the life they were born into. This is the price of belonging to the empire of endurance. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more dives into the fascinating corners of history. We'll see you in the next one. The second day dawns not with light, but with wind. It begins as a whisper, a shifting hiss across the dunes that you might almost mistake for a trick of the ear. But the veterans know this sound. It isn't a breeze, it's a warning. Within minutes, the hiss grows into a steady hum, then a deep, guttural roar that seems to rise from the very heart of the earth. Sandstorms in the Sahara are nothing like the storms you know. There's no rain, no thunder, no lightning. They are simply moving walls of blindness, a churning apocalypse of sand and wind that erases the world. Before the wall of ochre dust hits, a frantic, practiced choreography unfolds. The riders pull indigo clother, famous Tuareg *Tagelmust* up over their mouths and noses, wrapping it tight until only their eyes are visible. They wrap their hands, shielding their skin from the stinging particles, and quickly tie down any loose gear on their horses. The animals know what's coming. They whinny and rear, their eyes wide with terror. Their hooves, which moments ago trod firmly on packed sand, now sink into the softening dunes as the ground itself seems to liquefy. The chaos descends without a thunderclap, a silent, suffocating onslaught. Through the rising howl, the commander screams orders. His voice, usually a booming command that carries across the plains, is ripped away by the wind, a mere scrap of sound lost in the maelstrom. The disciplined formation we saw yesterday shatters. Men cling desperately to their reins, their knuckles white. Some are thrown from their spooked horses, disappearing instantly into the brownout. Others, still mounted, are simply swallowed by the dust, vanishing as if they never were. For 3 long, agonizing hours, the storm rages. Inside the tempest, there is no up or down, no east or west. There is only the scream of the wind, the suffocating press of dust, and the desperate fight to breathe. It's an eternity spent in a state of sensory deprivation, where the only reality is the terror in your own heart and the frantic pulse of the animal beneath you. And then, as suddenly as it began, it passes. The roar recedes to a whisper, and the thick, blinding dust begins to settle. The sun, a pale, hazy disk, reappears in a sky the color of washed-out linen. The desert that emerges is utterly new, its contours reshaped, its landmarks erased. It's as if the earth has forgotten itself and been reborn. The silence that follows is more deafening than the storm itself. One by one, riders emerge from the haze like ghosts. But the numbers are wrong. A quick, panicked count reveals the devastating truth. Half the riders are missing. Gone. Vanished into the storm. The captain, his face a mask of grime and despair, dismounts. He falls to his knees, his fingers trembling as they brush against the tip of a spear, half buried in a newly formed dune. It's a silent testament to a life lost. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine the scene. The fire crackles softly, a small point of warmth and light in the immense, silent darkness. We rest with the survivors beneath a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars. The memory of the storm still raw. A lone rider emerges from the lingering dust on the horizon. His indigo veil is torn, flapping in the gentle breeze. He leads a weary horse, a solitary silhouette moving slowly across the pale, moonlit sand. The world feels ancient and vast. The survivors slowly regroup. They are battered, bruised, and spiritually broken, but they are alive. They call out names into the twilight, their voices hoarse, but the only answer is the sigh of the wind. The missing men are never found. They have been claimed by the Sahara, absorbed into the landscape itself. That night, there are no songs of glory. The men gather in small, huddled groups, their prayers quiet and desperate. They pray not for victory or riches, but simply for endurance, for the strength to see the next sunrise. One young soldier, his voice cracking, whispers to the man beside him, "Perhaps the desert keeps the brave for itself." The older soldier, his face a roadmap of scars and sun-bleached lines, shakes his head slowly. He puts a hand on the boy's shoulder and replies, "No, brother. The desert doesn't care for bravery. It only takes the thirsty." A chilling reminder of their true enemy out here. As dusk deepens, staining the sky in shades of purple and orange, a new threat appears on the horizon, a thin plume of smoke. At first, they hope it's a trick of the light, another phantom. But this is no mirage. It's the smoke of a campfire. Raiders. And this time, they are real. There is no time for strategy, no time for formation. The attack is a blur of motion and violence. The Tuaregs strike with terrifying speed, their figures materializing from the twilight. They are masters of this terrain, moving like desert spirits. Their curved blades flash in the dying light, catching the last rays of the sun. The clash is sudden, brutal, and terrifyingly intimate. It's not a battle of formations, but a series of desperate, individual duels. Horses collide, their screams mingling with the shouts of men. Sand, kicked up by the struggle, rises again, creating a chaotic fog of war. The air fills with the sounds of impact metal on metal, flesh on sand, and the agonized cries of the wounded. A Kanem-Bornu lancer, charging with righteous fury, impales his foe with a perfectly aimed thrust. But in his moment of victory, he loses his grip on the reins. His horse shies, and he tumbles from the saddle, hitting the ground hard. Disoriented, he crawls through the dust, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. He looks up, and through the haze of battle, he sees the sky burning, a brilliant, terrible gold. It is the last beautiful thing he will ever see. Silence, when it finally returns, is heavy and final. The raiders have melted back into the dunes as quickly as they appeared, taking horses, supplies, and lives with them. In the aftermath, the survivors take another grim count. 15 more of their comrades lie still upon the sand. The cost of this journey is measured not in miles, but in men. There is no time for elaborate ceremony. They bury their fallen brothers in shallow graves, the soft sand making the work quick and somber. They mark each grave with a small pile of stones, a humble monument against the vastness. As they work, they speak a single verse, a phrase known across the empire. From the fertile south to this barren wasteland, to the earth we belong, and to it we return. Let's pause again. The wind cools now, carrying the chill of the deep desert night. The world, which a moment ago was filled with violence and noise, begins to breathe again. We see the freshly mounded graves, a small, sad archipelago in a sea of dunes under the twilight. From a spear stuck in the sand beside one grave, a string of prayer beads hangs, swaying gently in the breeze. A final, silent prayer for a fallen friend. The captain sits apart from the others, a piece of parchment spread across his knee. By the light of a flickering torch, he carefully writes down the name of every man they lost today. The ink bleeds slightly on the rough paper. When he is finished, he slowly folds the parchment. He presses it to his forehead in a gesture of reverence and grief, then tucks it securely into a pouch on his saddle. These names will not be forgotten. They will be carried with him. He looks out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of sand that stretches into the darkness. There is no victory here, only survival. But tomorrow he will rise. He will gather what's left of his men, and he will ride again. Because that is his duty. Because that is what the Empire demands. The vast expanse of the Sahara, a place of relentless heat and blinding light by day, offers a sliver of mercy when the sun finally dips below the horizon. As darkness drapes itself over the dunes, a profound quiet descends, broken only by the crackle of small fires. Around these flickering beacons of warmth and light, the cavalrymen of the Kanem-Bornu Empire gather. Their faces, usually hidden behind indigo veils, are now illuminated in the gentle orange glow, creating a mosaic of ghostly visages against the deep, star-strewn canvas of the night sky. The air grows cool, a welcome reprieve from the day's oppressive furnace. Behind the men, their trusted horses stand as silent sentinels, their breath misting softly in the cool desert air. These magnificent animals, the lifeblood of the cavalry, are more than just mounts. They are companions who have shared every hardship, every scorching mile. The men tend to them with a quiet reverence, checking their hooves, offering them precious water, their movements slow and deliberate after a long day's ride. The bond between rider and horse is palpable, an unspoken understanding forged in the crucible of this unforgiving landscape. The men huddle closer to the flames, the firelight dancing in their weary eyes. Conversation begins to stir, not in loud pronouncements, but in fragments, in whispers that seem to be swallowed by the immense silence of the desert. They speak of things far removed from this sandy wilderness. They speak of home, their voices tinged with a longing that the vast distance cannot diminish. They recall the scent of cooking fires in their villages, the taste of familiar food, the sound of children's laughter echoing through the compounds. They speak of the women they left behind, mothers, wives, sisters, their images conjured in the flickering flames. Their strength, a distant but steady anchor. They share dreams, not the grand ambitions of conquest, but the simple, profound dreams of a peaceful life. A good harvest, a healthy family, a return to the shores of the great Lake Chad. These are the hopes that fuel their endurance, the private treasures they carry within them through the endless dunes. Yet, there is a heavy, unspoken topic that hangs in the air, a shadow that the firelight cannot banish. No one mentions the dead, the comrades lost, the skirmishes fought, the fresh graves marked only by a pile of stones. These are locked away in the silent chambers of their hearts. To speak of them would be to give them a power they cannot afford to acknowledge, to invite a grief that could shatter their resolve. The desert demands a certain kind of strength, a hardness that can carry sorrow without breaking. As the quiet settles back in, a storyteller among them, an older man with eyes that have seen countless desert nights, begins to hum. It's an old Kanuri song, a melody as ancient as the sands themselves. The rhythm is hypnotic, echoing the steady, rhythmic beat of horses' hooves on a long march. The song tells a timeless story, a saga woven into the very fabric of their culture. It sings of the rise of great kings, of mighty empires built and defended by warriors just like them. It speaks of legendary journeys across this very desert, of courage and sacrifice. And woven through it all is a promise, a deeply held belief that gives them solace in this desolate place. The promise that all riders, all who venture into the vast emptiness, will one day find their way back to the shores of Lake Chad. The melody floats out from their small circle, a fragile thread of sound in the immense darkness. It is half prayer, half lullaby, a plea for safekeeping and a gentle song to soothe their tired souls. It's a testament to their resilience, a reminder that they are part of a lineage, a long line of horsemen who have faced this same sky, this same silence. The song connects them to their ancestors, to their history, and to the future they hope to see. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine yourself with them. The fire hums softly, a living thing in the heart of the night. The scent of wood smoke and hot sand fills the air. Above, the sky is a breathtaking dome of purest black, so clear that the Milky Way spills across it like a river of diamonds. And just then, a shooting star streaks across the silence, a fleeting slash of silver against the infinite. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated magic, a cosmic spectacle that makes you feel both incredibly small and profoundly connected to everything. You can almost feel the weight of the day lifting, replaced by a sense of peace and awe. The world shrinks to this small circle of warmth, this shared moment of tranquility under the watchful eyes of the stars. But peace in the desert is a fleeting visitor. When sleep finally comes, it is not deep or restorative. It is shallow, restless, punctuated by the shifting of the sand and the distant cry of a nocturnal creature. The men dream, not of glory or riches, but of the one thing the desert withholds so cruelly. They dream of rain. They dream of cool, life-giving water, of downpours that turn the parched earth to mud, of the scent of wet soil and blooming flowers. But it is only a dream. The desert gives none. Dawn arrives not with a gentle blush, but with a swift, stark change in light. The deep indigo of the night sky bleeds into a pale, pearlescent grey, and then, with startling speed, the sun's first rays spear over the horizon, setting the dunes ablaze with colour. The brief mercy of the night is over. The men rise, their movements stiff and slow. Their armor, which offered protection yesterday, is now heavy with sand that has worked its way into every joint and crevice. Their eyes are red-rimmed with fatigue and the constant sting of fine dust. There is no ceremony, no grand speech. There is only the quiet, disciplined routine of the soldier. They stretch their sore limbs, the aches, a familiar complaint from their bodies. They prepare their mounts, the movements practiced and efficient. Then they swing themselves into their saddles, a collective groan and sigh passing through the group. They are once again the cavalry of Kanem-Bornu. Turning their faces northward, they move toward their command post, their silhouettes stark against the rising sun. When they arrive, they will report their patrol as successful. The words will be formal, precise, and devoid of emotion. They will speak of distances covered, of territories secured, of the absence of enemy activity. They will deliver the cold, hard facts required by their superiors. What they will not mention is the other reality of their journey. They will not mention the hidden graves they left behind, the quiet ceremonies for fallen comrades conducted under the harsh glare of the sun. They will not speak of the gnawing fear that accompanies every shadow and every strange sound in the wilderness. And they will certainly not describe the profound, soul-crushing silence that followed each loss, a silence that felt heavier than any armor. They withhold these truths not out of dishonesty, but out of duty. Because to be a cavalryman of the Kanem-Bornu Empire is to understand one fundamental principle above all others. It is to endure. To endure the heat, the thirst, the fatigue, the loss. And to endure is, ultimately, to obey. They are the instruments of the Empire, the sharp edge of its power, and their personal burdens are secondary to the mission. Their stoicism is their shield, their discipline their strength. They carry the unspoken stories within them, a silent testament to the true cost of empire. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, its light becomes a blinding, all-consuming glare. The cavalryman, now just a small, dark line moving across the shimmering sands, begin to blur. The heat haze rises from the dunes, distorting their forms, making them waver like a mirage. Slowly, inexorably, they are absorbed by the vast, luminous landscape. They vanish into the light, their individual shapes and stories dissolving into the horizon. They become small shadows, swallowed by the immensity of the desert, by the vast, silent sweep of eternity, just as countless riders have done before them, and as countless will do after. They say, when Idris Aluma was born, the Sahara itself exhaled. A hot, dry wind carried his name across the vast Kanem Plains, a name that would soon be whispered in bustling markets, recited in the cool shade of mosques, and feared in the flickering firelight of enemy tents. He wasn't born to comfort or to silk pillows, but to dust, discipline, and a destiny that seemed woven into the very fabric of the desert. He grew up among horsemen whose eyes had memorized the horizon, who could read the shifting sands like a map. From his earliest days, Aluma learned that survival here wasn't about luck. It was about preparation. Every hoof print in the dust could be an omen. Every waterskin, a promise of life or a cleverly laid trap. His mother, a woman of profound wisdom, once told him, "The sun burns equally upon the foolish and the wise, but only the wise learn to ride its heat." And ride it he did. As a boy, he watched the savannah erupt in flames of conflict. Nomads would strike at merchant caravans. Rival clans would steal cattle under the cover of darkness, and blood feuds stretched back so far that no one remembered how they started. He saw chaos, a world unraveling at the seams, and in that chaos he found his calling to impose order. The elders of Bornu would speak in hushed, reverent tones of a golden age, of past greatness, of kings who had ruled from the shores of Lake Chad all the way to the distant oases of Fezan. Listening to these tales, a young Aluma vowed to bring that age back, to rebuild what had been broken. He trained relentlessly with sword and spear, his body becoming as hard as the sun-baked earth. But his true genius wasn't in the strength of his arm. It was in the sharpness of his mind. He was a strategist. Where others saw a band of enemies, he saw their vulnerable supply routes. Where others saw a simple oasis, he saw a strategic staging point for conquest. He would read Quranic verses about justice and leadership, and then he would translate them into battlefield tactics, into principles of unwavering discipline for his future army. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine us, sitting by a crackling fire as the desert night breathes around us. The air hums with the ghosts of stories, of ambition, of men who would not rest until the very horizon bowed before them. This is the world that shaped Idris Aluma. When he finally took the throne in the late 1500s, the Kanem-Bornu Empire was a shadow of its former self. It was fractured, its vital trade routes weakened and plagued by bandits. Tribute from vassal states went unpaid, and the morale of the people was dangerously low. His first move was one of profound stillness. For 40 days, he said almost nothing. He simply watched. He observed the movements of his court, listened to the whispers of his soldiers, and felt the weary pulse of his kingdom. Then, like the first silent flash of steel being drawn from its scabbard, he moved. His first act was to completely restructure the cavalry. There would be no more ragged, undisciplined bands of riders chasing after personal loot. He instituted a system of order. Each horseman was given a number, a code, a banner to follow. He created elite units called the Cavalrymen, who were trained not just to fight, but to think. They learned to maneuver in the swirling sand and choking smoke as if they were a single, living organism, their movements precise and deadly. But Aluma's most revolutionary move was his embrace of gunpowder. Guns had trickled into the region from Ottoman traders and North African allies, but most rulers treated them as little more than noisy curiosities, flashy toys for royal parades. Aluma saw them differently. He saw them as prophecy. He studied how flame could roar from an iron tube, how a small lead ball could bring a king on his war horse to his knees. He understood its power to reshape the battlefield. Soon, his disciplined cavalry rode into battle with highly trained musketeers marching at their flanks. It was a terrifying combination. The thunder of hooves united with the roar of gunpowder. Under his command, the banners of Bornu flew once again over the ancient forts of Kanem, over the vital salt wells of Bilma, and the wealthy caravan stations of the Air Mountains. But victory alone was not enough for him. He craved permanence. Each fortress he captured was not just occupied, but rebuilt with new, stronger bricks and governed by new, stricter laws. He instilled a rigid code of conduct. His soldiers prayed together before a battle, and any man caught looting after a victory was flogged without mercy. Idris Aluma made war sacred, an extension of divine will and order. He would often say, "An army without faith is a beast with too many heads, each pulling in a different direction." And he lived by this belief. He prayed with his men, not above them. He ate the same rations, felt the same desert sun on his skin, and knelt beside them on the sand. They saw him bleed, they saw him grieve. They saw him share their hardship sand. For that, they were willing to die for him. The result of all this was more than just a conquered empire. It was a new rhythm for the entire region. The sound of the hooves of Bornu's cavalry became a steady, powerful pulse beating across the heart of the Sahara. The world, which had forgotten the power of Kanem-Bornu, learned once again to fear the riders from the shores of Lake Chad. Let's pause again, friend. The fire whispers low. The stars overhead shimmer like the sharp edges of drawn blades. We have just seen the birth of a commander, a brilliant tactician. But his story is far from over. Next, we will witness how he took this military machine and forged an entire system of governance. A bureaucracy so efficient and so unsparing that even his enemies could unhelp but admire its brutal effectiveness. Idris Aluma forged a new military machine, one armed with firearms and fueled by a burning ambition to restore the Bornu Empire. But a sword, no matter how sharp, is useless without a hand to guide it. An army, no matter how disciplined, will starve without a system to feed it. Aluma's true genius wasn't just in winning battles, it was in building the state that made those victories possible. This is the story of how he reformed administration, logistics, and intelligence, blending faith and militarism into an unbreakable structure. Order that was Aluma's true religion. In his eyes, chaos was heresy. To govern was to measure every grain of millet, every drop of blood. He understood that an empire wasn't just conquered, it had to be managed, catalogued, and controlled. His vision was to transform the sprawling, often chaotic territories of Bornu into a single, cohesive unit. A machine where every part moved in unison with his will. He started with the very arteries of his empire, the roads. Before Aluma, travel between distant garrisons was a perilous affair, subject to ambushes and the whims of the unforgiving landscape. He commissioned the construction of new roads connecting his forts, creating narrow veins of communication that pulsed through the wilderness. These weren't grand highways, but they were efficient and, more importantly, they were secure. Small detachments of riders, loyal and swift, patrolled these routes, acting as both guards and messengers. They reported weekly to the capital, Engazagamu, carrying updates on everything from troop morale to the price of salt in a remote market. Nothing escaped the Sultan's notice. This network of information was revolutionary. It meant that Aluma could react to threats with unprecedented speed. A rebellion brewing in the south. He'd know before it could gather steam. A rival chieftain making overtures to an enemy. The report would be on his desk within days. This was the birth of a sophisticated intelligence network, woven into the very fabric of his military logistics. Caravans moving along these protected routes were now catalogued. Horses, the lifeblood of his cavalry, were branded and registered. Even the muezzins, the men who called the faithful to prayer in the most remote outposts, were not just religious figures. They were state agents, registered by name and rank, their loyalty assured. But perhaps Aluma's most radical innovation was the introduction of written records. Think about that for a moment. In a society that had long relied on oral tradition and memory, he brought the power of the written word to the heart of his military. He mandated the use of Arabic script for all army administration. Suddenly, the ephemeral became permanent. Payrolls were no longer a matter of a commander's word. They were meticulously kept ledgers. Supply inventories tracked every spear, every bag of grain, every waterskin. Casualty lists transformed the anonymous losses of war into concrete data. Imagine the scene. Inside a sun-baked mud-brick administrative hall, canary scribes in their flowing robes bend over parchment. The only sounds are the scratching of their reed pens and the rustle of paper. Their fingers, blackened with ink, are weaving the unseen sinews of empire. These men, rarely celebrated in the tales of warriors, were the silent architects of Aluma's success. They were the unseen warriors behind the saddlemen, ensuring that every soldier was paid. Every garrison was supplied, and every loss was accounted for. Let's pause for a moment. Feel the cool breath of the sand against the stone walls. It's easy to forget that paper can build empires just as surely as swords. With these records, Aluma could plan campaigns with a precision his enemies could only dream of. He knew his strength, his resources, and his limits, down to the last man and the last measure of millet. Aluma's reforms didn't stop at the barracks. He understood a fundamental truth that many rulers miss. War must feed on commerce, or it will starve. A powerful army is a hungry army, and it needs a thriving economy to sustain it. He turned his methodical, orderly mind to the bustling markets of Bornu. He standardized the price of salt, a vital commodity in the Sahara. He fixed the tolls that caravans paid, eliminating the arbitrary extortion by local chiefs that had stifled trade for generations. And then he implemented a tax system that was both rigorous and purposeful. The revenue collected didn't just disappear into the Sultan's coffers. It was strategically allocated to fund both the mosques and the armories. It paid for the scholars who taught the Quran and the blacksmiths who forged the swords. This dual investment reinforced his vision of a state built on the twin pillars of faith and military might. But how do you ensure such a system isn't crippled by corruption? Aluma had an answer for that, too. Every marketplace, from the grand bazaars of the capital to the smallest village square, had his spies. These weren't just informants looking for rebellion. They were auditors, watching for corrupt tax collectors and merchants trying to cheat the system. They were the Sultan's eyes and ears, ensuring his economic engine ran smoothly and efficiently. When corruption or treason was found, Aluma's justice was swift, public, and terrifying. Those found guilty faced trials held in the open, under the stern gaze of Quranic scholars who interpreted the law. The punishments were ritualized, broadcast as a message to all. They were designed not just to deter crime, but to ritually purify the community of the transgression. It was severe, yes, but beneath the severity was a profound efficiency. Caravans now moved with a new sense of safety. Merchants, protected from both bandits and corrupt officials, prospered. And across the Sahel, the name of Bornu became synonymous with stability and order. If you were a trader, you knew that your goods and your life were safer under the banner of Idris Aluma. Nowhere was this blend of militarism and order more apparent than in his diplomacy. Aluma didn't just see other nations as potential enemies or allies. He saw them as sources of knowledge, as opportunities to strengthen his own machine. He established a formal correspondence with the mighty Ottoman Empire, the superpower of the age. He wasn't just asking for friendship, he was a student of their power. He adopted their advanced cannon designs and, crucially, invited their military advisors to Bornu. These Turkish experts brought with them the latest techniques in siege warfare and firearm tactics, further honing the edge of Aluma's army. His diplomatic reach extended across North Africa. He sent emissaries to Tripoli and Fezzan, not merely to negotiate trade deals for horses and firearms, but to learn. His ambassadors were also his spies, gathering intelligence on political currents, new technologies, and military strategies. For Idris Aluma, knowledge itself had become a weapon, as valuable as any cannon or musket. This thirst for knowledge and improvement was then brought back home and institutionalized. He created permanent training camps, modeled directly on the Ottoman barracks his advisors described. This was a departure from the seasonal levies of the past. Here, soldiers drilled relentlessly from dawn, perfecting their maneuvers and mastering their new weapons. At dusk, their training continued, as they memorized battle hymns that reinforced their loyalty, their faith, and their identity as soldiers of Bornu. It was a holistic approach to creating a warrior class that was professional, disciplined, and ideologically committed. And this mobilization wasn't limited to men. Aluma understood that an army marches on its stomach and depends on a vast support network. Women played crucial, though often unseen, roles in his imperial machine. They were the managers of logistics, the keepers of the vital supply depots near Lake Chad. They maintained the thousands of horses that formed the backbone of the cavalry. They organized the transport of food and water that allowed his armies to campaign deep in enemy territory. Aluma's empire was not just a collection of men on horses. It was an entire community mobilized for conquest and governance. A society where every member had a role to play in the grand project of the state. Let's pause again. Imagine the Sahelian night. The wind rustles through the acacia trees, whispering of the burdens that leaders carry. Idris Aluma's greatness, his obsession with order and perfection, came at a price. It required a mind that was always calculating, always planning, a mind chained to the relentless pursuit of perfection. It forged a heart that grew wary of mercy, seeing it as a potential weakness, a crack in the armor of the state. By the height of his reign, the Sultan's rule stretched wide across the Lake Chad basin, a testament to his vision and his will. But even in the strongest structures, cracks can begin to form beneath the surface. His relentless drive for control began to breed resentment. Some nobles, whose traditional powers he had curtailed, whispered that the Sultan's hand was too heavy, that his grip was strangling them. Others, more pious, worried that he had replaced true faith with a rigid, state-enforced fear. They saw the scholar judges and the military police and wondered if the spirit of Islam was being lost in the machinery of empire. But Aluma was a pragmatist, a man forged by the harsh realities of his world. He had seen what chaos did. He had seen empires crumble. He knew that without a strong, even fearful, central authority, the desert swallows nations whole. He would much rather be cursed by his own subjects for his severity than be pitied by his enemies for his weakness. And so, the great gears of his empire ground on loud, gleaming and utterly relentless, shaping the destiny of a region for generations to come. The desert remembers. It remembers footsteps long after the men who made them have turned to dust. Somewhere in the vast, whispering expanse between the life-giving wells of Kowar and the ancient borders of Houseland. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. A phantom rhythm. The echo of Idris Aluma's drums. It's a sound that has haunted this land for centuries. A ghost of a once unshakable power. Each beat of those drums once summoned riders from 1,000 miles away. Each echo carried not just orders from a sultan, but the unspoken prayers of his soldiers, their private regrets, their bone-deep exhaustion. Because even empires built on unwavering order, on the foundation of iron discipline, tremble beneath the weight of their own perfection. The stronger the structure, the more devastating the cracks when they finally appear. So, let's pause here for a moment. Just listen. Can you hear it? That slow, haunting drumbeat that once marked the glorious sunrise parades and the solemn midnight burials alike. It's the heartbeat of an empire at its zenith, and the death knell for the men who sustained it. Today, we're not just talking about battles and borders. We're listening for the whispers in between the lines of history. We're exploring the human cost of Aluma's grand vision, the fatigue, the faith, and the fragility that hid behind its iron facade. This is the story of what happens when the architect of an empire begins to contemplate his own mortality. His soldiers, the proud and fearsome cavalry of the Kanem-Bornu Empire, grew old on campaign. Imagine spending your youth, your prime, your entire adult life in the saddle, moving from one conquest to the next. Their horses, just as legendary, bore scars that ran deeper than their riders. Young recruits, boys with fire in their eyes, were constantly needed to replace fallen heroes, inheriting armor that still carried the faint, lingering smell of blood, sweat, and incense. A grim inheritance, but a proud one. The soldiers were the sinew of this empire, and they were stretched to their absolute limit. They were more than just warriors. They were engineers, building fortified camps that became permanent towns. They were diplomats, enforcing the Sultan's law in newly conquered territories. They were missionaries of a sort, the physical embodiment of Aluma's vision of an ordered Islamic state. But the constant campaigning took its toll. We have accounts of veterans who had not seen their homes in a decade, whose children had grown into adults in their absence. Their loyalty was to Aluma, yes, but it was a loyalty forged in the crucible of shared hardship. Their faith was not just in God, but in the man who led them, the man who promised them victory and a place in a grander design. This was the human engine of the empire, and it was running on fumes. Over time, Idris Aluma's victories grew quieter. It wasn't because the battles ceased, or the enemies became weaker. It was because triumph had become routine. The conquest of a new city, the subjugation of a rival chieftainate, was no longer a cause for massive celebration, but an expected outcome. Another task checked off the endless list of imperial administration. The exceptional had become the mundane. The Sultan himself aged, not just in years, but in spirit. He became more withdrawn, surrounded not by the boisterous energy of his campaign tents, but by the hushed reverence of clerics. The calculated reports of his generals, and the silent ghosts of wars that none dared question. He began to speak less of conquest and more of legacy. The sword, having carved out the empire, was slowly being sheathed. His focus shifted from expansion to consolidation. He initiated one of the most ambitious building programs in the region's history. He commissioned the construction of magnificent mosques, brick by brick, not just as places of worship, but as symbols of Bornu's piety and permanence. He funded the digging of wells along critical trade routes, turning dangerous, arid stretches of the Sahara into safer passages for merchants and pilgrims. He understood that an empire isn't held by force alone, but by the infrastructure that makes life possible, that makes the state indispensable to its people. And he built schools. He became a great patron of learning, sponsoring scholars to write the chronicles of Bornu. He wanted his story, the story of his empire, to be recorded for posterity. But he was a meticulous editor of his own legend. He personally reviewed the words of the court historians, ensuring that history would remember him not just as a conqueror, but as a just ruler, a devout Muslim, a warrior, and a saint. He was crafting his own epitaph, chiseling his image into the very stone of history, ensuring that future generations would see him as he saw himself, the architect of a golden age. But history is never merciful. It has its own narrative, and it rarely aligns perfectly with the intentions of great men. After Idris Aluma's death, the intricate system he had so carefully forged began to unravel. It turned out that the empire's greatest strength was also its most profound weakness. It was all held together by his personal genius, his charisma, his iron will. Without him, the bureaucracy that had been so efficient under his watchful eye softened into comfortable complacency. The discipline he instilled in his army began to fray. Regional governors, once held in check by his authority, began to eye their own ambitions. Rivals, long suppressed, rose from the shadows. The soldiers, once the proud, disciplined cavalry of a unified state slowly morphed into something else. Their loyalty, once pledged to the Sultan and the Empire, became transactional. They became mercenaries, their services for sale to the highest bidder, often fighting for the very regional lords who were chipping away at the central authority. The Empire endured in name, its borders still vast on the maps, but its heartbeat, that powerful, rhythmic drum of a Lumasira, slowed to a faint, irregular pulse. The spirit was leaving the body, even as the shell remained. The architecture was still standing, but the architect was gone, and no one knew how to read his blueprints. Still, while the political structure of his empire weakened, the legend of Idris Aluma never died. Among the Kanuri people, his name became myth. He was the standard against which all future leaders were measured, and all were found wanting. Children learned his maxims, passed down through generations like sacred proverbs. Measured twice, strike once, a testament to his strategic caution. And faith is the bridle of power, a reminder that ambition must always be restrained by piety and justice. These weren't just quaint sayings, they were the distilled wisdom of a man who had mastered the brutal art of statecraft. Even now, centuries later, his presence lingers. They say that when camel caravans cross the vast, dry basin of what was once a much larger lake, Chad, and the wind howls in that lonely, desolate way it does, the traders whisper his name. They whisper it for protection, for guidance, as if the ghost of the great Sultan still rides the desert winds, watching over the realm he carved from the sand and stone. His empire may have faded, but his story is woven into the very fabric of the land and its people. So, let's pause one final time. Imagine us here, the fire of our story having burned low, casting long, dancing shadows across the sand. What we've seen tonight is not just a man of war, a conqueror of territory. We've witnessed a poet of structure, a man who saw the chaos of his time and sought to impose upon it an elegant, enduring architecture. He turned the anarchy of competing chiefdoms into an empire, but in doing so, he left behind both glory and ghosts. The story of Idris Aluma is a timeless lesson that even the most formidable empires are mortal, and that the true measure of a leader is not just what they build, but what endures in the hearts of their people, long after the walls have crumbled to dust. Have you ever stood in a place where the wind seems to speak, where it hums through hollow towers, and the earth itself feels like it remembers ancient secrets? Today, we're journeying to such a place, the Khoar Oasis, a necklace of ghostly fortresses strung between modern-day Libya and Chad. These forgotten strongholds are half swallowed by the relentless dunes of the Sahara, yet they cling fiercely to the memory of a once mighty empire under the legendary Idris Aluma. The locals have a name for them that sends a shiver down your spine. Kasar, Alsa, the castles of secrets. From a distance, they appear almost natural, like giant termite mounds shaped by wind and time, their rounded forms blending into the desert landscape. But as you draw closer, the illusion shatters. You begin to see the hand of man. Narrow arrow slits carved into the mud brick walls, the deep shafts of wells that once quenched the thirst of entire garrisons, and even in the quietest corners, the bones of forgotten guards still keeping their silent, eternal watch over roads that are no longer traveled. It's a humbling, haunting sight. Let's just pause for a moment here, as the sun sets and the desert around us falls into a deep, listening silence. It's easy to forget in our fast-paced world that stone, too, can dream. And these stones dream of caravans, of empires, and of the men and women who lived and died within their walls. Imagine a drone's view, rising high above one of these crumbling Sahelian fortresses. The sun is a fiery orb on the horizon, bathing the scene in a golden, almost liquid light. The dunes stretch endlessly in every direction, a vast, undulating sea of sand. This is the world these citadels commanded. They weren't just isolated outposts. They were the very lifeline of the Kanem-Bornu Empire. These were the fortresses that guarded the precious salt and gold caravans threading their way from Tripoli in the north, through the desolate Fezzan, all the way to the lush shores of Lake Chad. Each stronghold was a self-contained world, housing a small but formidable garrison of elite cavalry-disciplined musketeers. New and terrifying technology for the Taimand muezzins, whose calls to prayer would echo through the swirling dust, a testament to faith in one of the world's harshest environments. Their duty was stark and simple. Hold the wells, defend the trade routes, and if necessary, die where you stand. Life inside these walls was anything but glamorous. It was a life of extreme austerity and discipline. Picture it, a single, resilient date palm standing in the center of a dusty courtyard, providing the only shade. A simple prayer rug, carefully rolled and placed beside the captain's spear in his modest quarters. The nights here were colder than faith itself, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, while the days were hot enough to peel skin from steel. These weren't just forts in the conventional sense. They were endurance made manifest, a physical embodiment of human resilience against the overwhelming power of the desert. Imagine the dawn call to prayer. Soldiers, their faces weathered by sun and wind, stand atop the fortress walls. The desert wind catches the edges of their cloaks as they bow in unison, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. It was a ritual that connected them to their faith, their empire, and each other, a moment of peace before another day of vigilant watchfulness began. Over the centuries, these citadels evolved. They transformed from purely military installations into vital sanctuaries for all who traversed the desert. They became beacons of safety for weary merchants seeking refuge from the ever-present threat of Tuareg raids. They were havens for scholars, their precious manuscripts containing knowledge from across the Islamic world carefully wrapped in goatskin to protect them from the elements. And they were places of sorrowful pilgrimage for widows and mothers, following the caravan trails in a desperate search for sons and husbands who had marched into the desert and never returned. In this way, Koa became both the artery that pumped lifeblood into the empire and the graveyard that collected its ghosts. The stories whispered on the desert wind speak of incredible individuals who inhabited these forts. One legend, supported by historical fragments, tells of a fortress that was commanded not by a man, but by a woman. She was the widow of a general who had fallen in battle. When news of his death reached her, she refused to abandon her husband's post. With a will of iron, she took command of the garrison 50 of the Empire's finest riders and maintained a discipline that was renowned throughout the region. Her leadership was so effective, so unwavering, that it is said even the great Idris Aluma himself took note, mentioning her loyalty in his court records with the powerful words, "She stood as a pillar between sand and death." This single story reveals so much about the character of the people who held this frontier. Their sense of duty transcended gender, and their loyalty was as unyielding as the landscape they guarded. Let's take another moment to pause and reflect. As we imagine the flicker of a campfire, the shadows of these ancient walls dance across our minds. These citadels, though now slowly returning to dust, were once the very heartbeat of Kanem-Bornu's might. They were the physical proof of an audacious claim that even the Sahara, the great and terrible desert, could be tamed and brought into the fold of an empire, if only for a time. Their crumbling walls are a powerful reminder that human ambition, courage, and faith can carve out a space for civilization even in the most inhospitable places on Earth. The strategic genius of placing these forts cannot be overstated. They weren't randomly scattered. They formed a meticulously planned chain, a Kowar line that secured the Bilma salt mines, the source of one of the most valuable commodities in the medieval world. Salt was the white gold of the Sahara. Controlling its production and trade was equivalent to controlling the oil fields of today. These forts ensured that every slab of salt, every ounce of gold, and every bolt of cloth moving along this corridor did so under the protection and taxation of the Bornu state. Each fort was positioned within a few days' march of the next, creating an interlocking system of defense. A caravan under attack could send a rider ahead, and reinforcements would be dispatched from the nearest citadel. It was a sophisticated network that projected power deep into what many considered an ungovernable wasteland. The architecture itself was a masterclass in environmental adaptation. Built from local materials, primarily sun-dried mud bricks, reinforced with straw and palm fronds, the forts were designed to withstand the extreme climate. The thick walls provided incredible insulation, keeping the interiors relatively cool during the scorching days and retaining warmth during the frigid nights. The rounded towers and curving walls were not just an aesthetic choice. They were aerodynamic, designed to deflect the force of powerful sandstorms that could strip paint from metal. The wells, often dug incredibly deep to tap into subterranean aquifers, were the heart of each fort. Without a reliable water source, the garrisons, their animals, and the passing caravans would perish. The well was the most heavily guarded point, the anchor of life in a sea of death. But what of the men who manned these posts? They were a diverse group. Many were drawn from the Kanuri heartland, professional soldiers loyal to the Mai. Others were recruited from local desert peoples, their unparalleled knowledge of the terrain making them invaluable scouts and trackers. There were also slaves who served as soldiers and laborers, with the promise of freedom and social mobility for exceptional service, a common practice in many Sahelian empires. Their daily routine was grueling, a monotonous cycle of guard duty, training, and maintaining the fortress walls, which were under constant assault from the wind and sand. Boredom and isolation were enemies as dangerous as any raider. To combat this, they had storytelling, poetry, and their shared faith. The bonds forged in these remote outposts were incredibly strong, a brotherhood born of shared hardship and a common purpose. The eventual decline of these fortresses mirrors the decline of the trans-Saharan trade itself. As European powers began establishing trading posts along the West African coast, the ancient caravan routes that had been the lifeblood of empires like Kanem-Bornu started to wither. The sea offered a faster, cheaper, and safer way to transport goods. Gold, salt, and slaves began to flow south towards the coast instead of north across the desert. With the trade diminishing, the strategic importance of the Kowar line faded. The garrisons were reduced, the walls fell into disrepair, and one by one, the castles of secrets were reclaimed by the sand. The muezzin's call was replaced by the whistle of the wind, and the courtyards that once bustled with soldiers and merchants fell silent. Today, visiting these ruins is an almost spiritual experience. To walk through a broken gateway and stand in the center of a courtyard, surrounded by the ghosts of an empire, is to feel the immense weight of history. You can trace the outlines of barracks, kitchens, and a small mosque. You can run your hand over the smooth, eroded surface of the walls and imagine the hands that built them over 500 years ago. These are not just archaeological sites. They are monuments to human tenacity. They tell a story of a great African empire that mastered the desert, of the brave men and women who defended its frontiers, and of the inevitable, relentless passage of time that brings all empires to their knees. The secrets of Kawar are not buried in treasure chests. They are written in the dust, carried on the wind, and etched into the silent, dreaming stones. If you're just joining us, we've journeyed deep into the heart of the Sahara, tracing the ghost-like contours of the Kanem-Bornu Empire's fortress network in the Kawar Oasis. These weren't just military outposts. They were islands of life in a sea of sand, monuments to human will. But survival in such an extreme environment came at a tremendous cost paid not in gold, but in sweat, spirit, and sacrifice. Today, we explore the social, spiritual, and environmental price of maintaining these desert citadels and the profound rituals of endurance they inspired. The deeper we venture into the whispers of Kawar, the more the silence seems to gain weight, to become a presence in itself. It's a silence filled with the echoes of history. Look around at these phantom walls. Every single fortress, without exception, was built beside a well. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were wounds deliberately cut into the earth, their shafts lined with the sturdy trunks of date palms and a desperate kind of hope. In this empire, water was the true currency, the real treasure. It was more valuable than any caravan's gold, more sacred in its own way than the holiest scripture. It was life itself, drawn drop by precious drop from the planet's heart. And each of these lifelines had a guardian. This wasn't a job for a soldier or a commander. It was a role of immense spiritual importance, entrusted to an old man or woman whose hands were wrinkled with the wisdom of seasons. Their task was far more than the physical labor of drawing water. They were its custodians, its blessers, before each leather bucket was lowered into the deep. They would whisper verses from the Quran into the darkness of the well, their voices a soft hum against the vast emptiness. They were the priests and priestesses of the desert, and the well was their sacred pulpit. Their presence consecrated the act, transforming it from a simple chore into a holy communion with the forces that governed survival. For everyone else, to fetch water was an act of pure faith. Imagine a soldier, armed and armored, standing under the relentless sun, waiting. They would watch for hours as the rope, a lifeline of braided palm fiber, descended deeper and deeper into the earth, the sound echoing down the shaft like a whispered prayer into the void. There was a belief, a deep-seated one, that the wells themselves had spirit-sentient, thirsty entities dwelling in the cool darkness below. If you didn't approach with respect, if you failed to greet them with the proper reverence, your efforts would be for naught. The bucket might return stubbornly empty, or worse, the rope could mysteriously snap mid-pull, a clear sign of the spirit's displeasure. The desert demanded respect, and it had its ways of enforcing it. Let's just pause here for a moment. Close your eyes if you can. Imagine you're standing there by the well's edge. Feel that cool wind brushing against your cheek. It's a real phenomenon in the desert as air is drawn into the cooler well shaft. But for the people of Kawar, this breeze carried more than just a change in temperature. It carried not ghosts, but gratitude. It was the desert breathing back, a sign that your offering of respect had been accepted. It was the sigh of the earth, a whisper of thanks for the life it sustained. Over centuries, these beliefs solidified into elaborate and beautiful rituals of respect for the wells. A new soldier arriving at a fortress for the first time underwent an initiation. They were given a cup of water drawn from the garrison's well, but it was mixed with a pinch of desert salt. This wasn't a punishment, it was a lesson, a potent reminder that purity and hardship, survival and struggle were inseparable companions in this land. It taught them to never take a single, clear drop for granted. When trade caravans, grateful to have survived the crossing, passed through a fortress, they would leave offerings at the well. These weren't grand treasures, but small tokens of immense personal value. Colorful beads, iridescent seashells, carried hundreds of miles from the coast, and sometimes even small, carefully folded fragments of parchment inscribed with Ker. Anik versus a thank you note to the unseen forces of survival. But the wells, like the empire itself, were not infinite. By the 17th century, the climate began to shift. The droughts grew longer, more severe. The life-giving seasonal rains became less reliable. Vicious sandstorms, growing in frequency and intensity, would rage for days, choking the wells and filling shafts that had taken generations to dig. The lifelines of the empire, one by one, began to clog and fail. The successors of the great Mai Idris Aluma, the architect of this system, tried desperately to fight back. They organized massive efforts to rebuild, to redig, to clear the sand. But it was a losing battle. The wells kept collapsing. The water table seemed to be receding. It was as if the desert itself, after centuries of feeding empires and armies, had simply grown tired. It was reclaiming its own. The great fortresses began to crumble. Without a reliable water source, a garrison couldn't be maintained. Without the soldiers, the walls offered no protection. Sand crept over the battlements, and the wind began to dismantle the mud brick ramparts, returning them to the dust from which they were made. The Empire's grip on this vital corridor loosened, then failed completely. The age of imperial control was ending, not with a bang, but with the dry whisper of sand filling an empty well. Yet life in Kawar did not cease. The artery of the desert, though weakened, still pulsed. The caravans, smaller now and more cautious, still made the perilous journey. Pilgrims on their way to Mecca, smugglers moving illicit goods under the cover of night, and griots, the traveling poets and historians all, continued to pass through this ancient landscape. They found shelter inside the ruined mosques, their prayers echoing in the same spaces as those from centuries before. They drank from cracked cisterns that still collected the rare rainfall, and from the few wells that stubbornly refused to die. And in the quiet of the morning, as the first light painted the dunes in shades of rose and gold, they would hear it. The same eternal wind song that had greeted every traveler before them. A sound that, if you listened closely, carried the ancient whisper of hoofbeats, the ghosts of Aluma's cavalry fading away toward the distant horizon. It was the sound of history becoming memory, of an empire becoming a legend. Let's pause once more. Imagine we're sitting here, as dusk falls over the ruins. A small fire crackles, its sparks dancing into the darkening sky. The sound is like soft rain on a dry roof. Even the silence here feels ancient, heavy with stories. It's in these moments that you understand the true legacy of It isn't found in the crumbling walls or the buried wells. It's in the enduring spirit of the people who learned to listen to the desert, to respect its power, and to survive not by conquering it, but by living in harmony with it. The story of the Kanem-Bornu Empire in the Kawar Oasis is a powerful lesson. It airs about the limits of power and the fragility of even the mightiest human endeavors when faced with the slow, inexorable forces of nature. It's a testament to the fact that our greatest technologies, our most ingenious strategies, are ultimately dependent on the health of the world that sustains us. The silent, sand-filled wells of Kawar are not just relics of a lost empire. They are a warning, whispering to us across the centuries about the true cost of survival, and the legacy it left behind, a legacy that still echoes in the sands of the Sahara today. The roads through Kawar were never truly abandoned. Even after the great empire faded into memory, its arteries, those ancient caravan paths, continued to pulse with life. Travelers followed the old ways, not by maps etched on parchment, but by an instinct woven into their very being, a memory carried in the blood and whispered by the wind across the dunes. These were paths of history, and to walk them was to walk alongside ghosts. They say that when the sun bleeds out over the horizon and the desert night drapes its velvet cloak over the sands, spirits ride along those roads. They say they are the cavalrymen of the great Idris Aluma, still patrolling the empire's forgotten frontiers. Their spectral armor is said to shimmer like starlight captured in a bottle, and their ethereal forms move with a grace that defies the living world. Traders huddled around their small fires, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and reverence, have sworn they've seen them. Horsemen without faces, their features blurred by time, their phantom hooves galloping silently, leaving no prints in the soft sand. The locals have a name for them. They call them the riders who forgot how to rest. Their loyalty to a fallen king so absolute that not even death could release them from their eternal vigil. Imagine it, a caravan, making its slow, weary way under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the Saharan sky. The only sounds are the soft padding of camel feet and the gentle creak of leather. Then, on the crest of a distant dune, a silhouette appears. Then another and another. Not a raiding party, not a rival caravan, but a column of ghostly riders. Their forms translucent against the Milky Way. They don't approach, they don't threaten. They simply ride, a silent, shimmering procession. A testament to an order that has long since crumbled but refuses to completely disappear. It's a chilling, beautiful sight, a reminder that in the desert, the past is never truly buried. It's just waiting for the right light to reveal itself. Among the Kanuri griots, the keepers of memory and the weavers of history, the ruins of Kawar became something more than just crumbling walls and forgotten fortresses. They transformed into places of pilgrimage, sacred sites where the soul of their people could be communed with. These oral historians would travel for weeks to reach the skeletal remains of a once mighty garrison. There they would sit in circles, the setting sun casting long, mournful shadows from the remaining walls. As dusk settled, they would draw their wooden flutes to their lips. The melodies that flowed from them were not the bombastic anthems of war or the triumphant marches of victory. They were slow, haunting, and deeply melancholic. The notes would drift through the broken archways and across the silent courtyards, weaving through the air like threads of sorrow and smoke. And then the stories would begin. They would recite the verses passed down through generations, poems about the harsh discipline that built the empire, the profound loss felt at its decline, and the quiet, stubborn endurance required to survive in its wake. These were not songs of war. They were lullabies for history itself, sung to soothe the restless ghosts of a bygone era. Let's just pause here for a heartbeat. Can you feel it? The fire is burning low now, its flames dancing like tired spirits. The desert night thickens around us, a deep, profound blackness that seems to swallow all sound. In this immense stillness, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the past exhale. It's a long, slow sigh, carrying with it the weight of centuries, echoes of marching feet, the murmur of forgotten languages, the silent prayers of soldiers far from home. This is the sound of time itself, breathing in the ruins. For generations after Bornu's power had waned, travelers from the far-flung oases of Fezzan and the marshy shores of Lake Chad still used Kawar as their compass. The empire was gone, but its bones provided a new kind of map. These were not landmarks of power, but landmarks of memory. A merchant leading his salt-laden camels would glance at the horizon and say to his companions, "We are 3 wells from the ghost fortress." A group of pilgrims, their faces weathered by the sun, would calculate their journey by saying, "We will make camp 2 days beyond the drums of a loop," referring not to actual drums, but to a place where the wind whistling through a particular ruin was said to mimic the sound of the old war drums. The ruins became a language, a vocabulary of sand and sorrow, of distance and time. A broken tower was not just a pile of stones, it was a signpost, a story, a warning. The names given to these places were infused with poetry and myth. A collapsed gate might be called the watchman's sigh. A dried-up well near a former outpost could be known as the captain's tear. The physical world and the world of stories had merged completely. To navigate the desert was to read a poem written in stone and decay. And so, the great fortresses of Kawa never truly died. They simply transformed. They shed their skin of military might and political power and were reborn as metaphors. They became symbols of quiet, unyielding endurance against the relentless march of time and sand. They stood as monuments to the steep price of order, reminding all who saw them how much blood and effort it takes to carve a moment of stability out of chaos. And perhaps most profoundly, they became symbols of the ultimate futility of trying to cage the desert, of trying to impose a permanent human will upon a landscape that measures time in millennia. The desert always wins. It just waits, patiently, for empires to fall and for walls to crumble before reclaiming its own. Let's rest here for a moment more, friend. Let the story settle. The fire softens now, its embers glowing with a gentle, hypnotic pulse. The wind, which was once harsh, now cools the air, carrying the scent of dust and distant oases. Our journey has shifted. We have moved from the realm of empire to the realm of echo, from the clamor of history to its quietest whisper, and soon our path will lead us from the windswept sands and into the perfumed, silken halls of those who ruled this vast domain. We will step into the courts where gold met intrigue, where power was a deadly game, and where even the shadows were scented with ambition and secrets. So far, we have traced the rise of the Kanem-Bornu Empire, a titan of the Sahel, forged in the crucible of trade, faith, and military might. We spoke of its great leaders, its sprawling influence, and the forces that shaped its destiny. Today, we journey from the vast, windswept plains into the very heart of that power. We're stepping inside the royal court of Bornu, a world of dazzling opulence, intricate diplomacy, and simmering rivalries that could make or break the empire. At the center of Bornu's universe stood its magnificent capital, and imagine a city that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a testament to human ingenuity against the stark beauty of the Sahel. Engazargamu wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a statement. A city of symmetry and sun, its layout a reflection of a well-ordered cosmos. And at its core, the palace shimmered like a desert mirage, its walls built from sun-baked clay, then painted with rich ochre and brilliant white lime. These weren't just walls. They were canvases that captured the light, glowing under the African sun. Guarding its massive gates were men who embodied the twin pillars of Bornu's strength. Formidable horsemen, their steeds restless and powerful, and watchful eunuchs, the silent keepers of the court's innermost secrets. Within these protected walls, life moved to a rhythm that was both ancient and precise. The Sultan's day was not a series of random events. It unfolded like clockwork, a sequence of ceremonies and duties, each moment steeped in tradition and considered sacred. The day began not with the sun, but with sound. At the first hint of dawn, The court's muezzins would ascend their minarets, and their calls to prayer would drift across the city, their voices weaving through the rustling palm groves, a spiritual awakening for the empire's soul. This was the first act in the daily theatre of power, reminding everyone, from the Sultan to the stable boy, of the divine order that underpinned their world. By mid-morning, the political heart of the empire began to beat. The Sultan's council would gather under elegant, domed pavilions in the palace courtyard. This was the brain trust of Bornu. Imagine the scene. Judges in flowing robes, their faces etched with the gravity of the law. Treasurers, their minds calculating the flow of gold, salt, and slaves. Celebrated poets, whose words could immortalize a ruler or subtly critique his reign. And the ever-present spies, their eyes missing nothing. They all gathered, a constellation of power, each waiting for the Sultan's nod, the signal that the day's business could commence. The air would be thick with anticipation, a silent tension that spoke of the high stakes of every decision made in this space. Let's just pause here for a moment. Close your eyes and try to construct this scene with your senses. Imagine the scent that filled the era-complex perfume of heavy incense brought by caravan from Arabia, mingling with the earthy, primal smell of horse sweat from the royal cavalry. Picture the sounds, the rhythmic beat of drums played by court musicians, setting a tempo for the day, punctuated by the sharp clatter of hooves on polished marble as messengers and guards moved through the courtyards. This wasn't just a court. It was a living, breathing, sensory experience, designed to awe and intimidate all who entered. It was a declaration of wealth, stability, and unshakable authority. The legacy of the great ruler Idris Aluma, who we discussed previously, was not a distant memory here. It was a living force. His revolutionary reforms still pulsed through the veins of this court long after his death. He had established a system of governance that was built on transparency and accountability, and his successors worked to maintain it. Every Friday, in the main square, the laws of the empire were read aloud for all to hear, ensuring that justice was not a secret known only to the elite. Military commanders were required to present detailed reports not just on battles won, but on the logistics of empire, the number of grain sacks in the storehouses, the health of the cavalry horses, and the morale of the troops on the farthest frontiers. And the Sultan's throne itself was the ultimate symbol of this principle. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, carved from gleaming ivory and intricately inlaid with precious red coral. But it was not merely a seat of comfort or a display of wealth. It was an altar of accountability. When the Sultan sat upon it, he was not just a king, he was the chief servant of his people, the final arbiter of justice, and the one ultimately answerable to God for the well-being of the empire. Every decree issued from that throne carried the weight of this immense responsibility. The throne was a constant physical reminder that power was a sacred trust, not a personal privilege. But beneath this veneer of perfect order and grandeur, the court was a labyrinth of hidden passages and whispered secrets. Like any center of immense power, it was a hotbed of ambition and intrigue. Nobles, heads of powerful clans with ancient lineages, would gather in shaded corners, their conversations quiet, their plotting subtle. They navigated a delicate dance of loyalty and ambition, always testing the boundaries of their influence. Merchants, grown wealthy from the trans-Saharan trade, knew that political favor was as valuable as gold. They would discreetly bribe scribes to alter ledgers or grant them exclusive trade privileges, greasing the wheels of commerce with secret payments. And then there were the spies, the unseen nerves of the empire. They moved through the court like ghosts, their faces unreadable, their jeweled turbans a deceptive mask for their true purpose. They would whisper their findings to the eunuchs, who controlled access to the palace's most private chambers. The eunuchs, in turn, would relay this vital information to the concubines in the royal harem. These women, often dismissed as mere ornaments of the court, were in fact some of the most astute political players. They had the ear of the Sultan in his most unguarded moments, and a single, well-placed word from a favored concubine could elevate a friend or ruin a rival. Power in the court of Bornu was like desert water, precious, vital, and never, ever still. It flowed through hidden channels, constantly shifting and carving new paths. Let's pause again and shift the scene. The sun has set, and the scorching heat of the day has given way to the cool desert night. The palace is now lit by the flickering orange glow of torches and open fires. In this dramatic light, every face seems transformed, half cast in brilliant gold, half swallowed by deep shadow. This duality of light and dark is a perfect metaphor for the court itself, a place of visible glory and hidden danger, of public ceremony and private conspiracy. It was in these firelit hours that the day's tensions might resolve, or new plots might be born, their seeds planted in the fertile ground of nighttime whispers. The Sultan's family, the Safua dynasty, was the epicenter of this complex world. The line of succession was a constant source of tension. While the Sultan held supreme authority, his brothers, sons, and powerful uncles were always in the wings. This created a delicate balance of power. A wise Sultan kept his potential rivals close, giving them important-sounding titles and responsibilities, but ensuring they never accumulated enough independent power to mount a challenge. He would pit them against each other, using their rivalries to his own advantage. A masterful game of chess where the pieces were his own kin. The loyalty of the royal guard and the key military commanders was paramount, and the Sultan spent a great deal of effort and resources securing it. Diplomacy was another grand performance. When ambassadors arrived from distant lands, from the Ottoman Empire in the north, or the kingdoms of the forest belt to the south, their reception was a meticulously choreographed event. They would be led through a series of grand courtyards, each more impressive than the last, designed to showcase Bornu's wealth and military might. They would be showered with gifts, fine silks, trained horses, and enslaved people, law symbols of the Sultan's generosity and power. But these exchanges were more than just polite formalities. They were negotiations. A gift of horses might be a subtle request for military aid. The acceptance of a particular type of cloth could signal agreement to a trade deal. Every gesture, every word was laden with meaning, scrutinized by both sides for signs of strength or weakness. And so, the royal court of Bornu was a microcosm of the empire itself. It was a place of immense cultural achievement, where Islamic scholarship and traditional arts flourished side by side. It was a center of economic power, the final destination for the great caravans that crossed the Sahara. And it was a political arena where the fate of millions was decided through a complex interplay of ceremony, law, and clandestine maneuvering. It was a world built on dualities of sun and shadow, order and chaos, loyalty and betrayal. Understanding this vibrant, dangerous heart is key to understanding the endurance and eventual decline of the great Kanem-Bornu Empire. We stand in the shadow of the Sultan, the dazzling sun at the center of the empire, but the sun doesn't shine in a void. It's surrounded by constellations, celestial bodies that move in its orbit, shaping its path through the cosmos. Today, we pull back the curtains of the royal court to reveal these constellations, the unseen. Pillars holding up the entire imperial structure. The women, the scholars, and the eunuchs. These were the silent forces, the quiet powers whose influence, though often unrecorded, was as critical as any decree signed by the Sultan himself. Let's begin with the women of the palace. If you imagine the court as a place of hushed whispers and veiled glances, you're on the right track. But behind those veils were minds as sharp as scimitars, playing a game of power with stakes higher than any battlefield. The most powerful woman was often the Sultan's mother, the Queen Mother. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was a master strategist. She negotiated alliances, not with armies, but through marriages. A daughter married to a provincial governor could secure loyalty far more effectively than a garrison of soldiers. A niece wed to a foreign prince could open up vital trade routes. These women were the diplomats of the dynasty, weaving a web of kinship that bound the empire together. Then there were the concubines and wives within the harem. It's easy to dismiss the harem as a place of leisure, but it was, in reality, a political microcosm. It was a fiercely competitive environment where information was the most valuable currency. Rival factions formed around powerful women, each vying for the Sultan's favor, each hoping their son would be the next heir. A secret whispered from one concubine to another could travel through the palace network, reaching the ears of a general or a vizier, and ultimately influencing state policy. They were the intelligence network of the court, their observations and allegiances subtly steering the ship of state from within its most private chambers. Their influence was subtle, like the scent of perfume in the air, light and pervasive, but capable of intoxicating the most powerful men. Now, let's turn our attention to another group, one that is often misunderstood or sensationalized: the eunuchs. In many empires, they were indispensable, and here, they were the empire's living memory. Often taken into service as boys, they received rigorous training, not in warfare, but in administration and literacy. Their minds were honed to become vast repositories of information. A senior eunuch could recite, from memory, decades of tribute records, complex legal precedents, and the intricate genealogies of rival clans. They didn't just store information, they controlled it. The eunuchs were the ultimate gatekeepers. Every petition, every letter, every visitor seeking an audience with the Sultan had to pass through them first. They decided who got access and who was turned away. They could accelerate a request from a loyal governor or misplace a plea from a troublesome one. This position gave them immense, albeit indirect, power. They were the nervous system of the palace, managing the royal archives, overseeing the treasury, and ensuring the day-to-day machinery of the court ran smoothly. They were everywhere and nowhere at once, ghosts in the corridors of power, their presence constant, their authority rarely acknowledged openly, but felt by all. They were trusted precisely because they could never found their own dynasty, their loyalty sworn only to the ruler and the institution he represented. And what of the soul of the empire? That was the domain of the scholars. They were the spiritual and intellectual anchors of the court. Recruited from the most prestigious centers of learning, they were masters of theology, law, poetry, and history. They filled the palace with the beauty of language, composing soaring odes in Arabic and Kanem-Bornu to celebrate a victory, or crafting elegant chronicles to immortalize the Sultan's reign. They were the custodians of the empire's moral compass. In public forums, they would engage in fierce debates on points of Islamic law, their arguments shaping the legal framework that governed millions. They served as judges, advisors, and tutors to the royal children, ensuring the next generation of rulers was steeped in the traditions of faith and justice. They were meant to be the moral mirrors to the rulers, speaking truth to power. Some embraced this role with courage, offering sincere counsel and warning against tyranny or decadence. They reminded the Sultan that his power was a trust from God, and that he would be judged not just by his conquests, but by his justice. Of course, not all scholars were so pure of heart. Power has a way of corrupting even the most pious. Many learned to flatter, to praise the glint of gold in the language of God. They became court poets who could find divine providence in even the most self-serving royal decree. They used their intellect not to guide, but to justify. This created a constant tension within the court, between the scholars who sought to hold the ruler to a higher standard, and those who simply sought to secure their own comfort and influence. This intellectual and moral struggle was as much a part of the palace's life as any political intrigue. So we have these three groups, operating in different spheres, but all interconnected. A woman in the harem might learn a secret and pass it to a trusted eunuch. That eunuch might then use that information to influence which scholar gets to advise the sultan on a critical matter. It was a complex, interlocking system of influence. The sultan might have held the scepter, but the stability of his throne depended on this delicate balance of unseen forces. The strength of the empire wasn't just in its armies, but in the intricate human network that managed its politics, its memory, and its soul from within the palace walls. Let's just pause here for a moment. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. The scent of incense, the rustle of silk, the low murmur of voices discussing matters of state in a gilded room. Can you feel the weight of it all? The ambition, the loyalty, the fear, the hope. There's an opulence, a richness that's almost overwhelming. But underneath it all, there's something else. A profound stillness, a sense of isolation. Even in a court teeming with hundreds of people, a deep solitude lingers. For the women confined to the harem, the world outside was a distant rumor. For the eunuchs set apart from society, true companionship was a rare commodity. And for the sultan himself, surrounded by supplicants and advisors, true friendship was nearly impossible. Who could he trust completely? Every word he heard was filtered through someone else's ambition. Every smile could hide a hidden motive. In this sense, palaces, for all their splendor, are also prisons. They are fortresses designed not just to keep enemies out, but to keep the powerful in. A prison of a finer, more beautiful design, but a prison nonetheless. This gilded cage was the center of the world, but for those who lived within it, it was also the edge of their own. The combined efforts of these groups created the culture of the court. It was a world of immense sophistication. Art, music, and literature flourished under their patronage. The debates of scholars pushed the boundaries of knowledge. The administrative skills of the eunuchs allowed for the management of a vast and complex state. The diplomatic maneuvering of the royal women secured the dynasty's future. Together, they projected an image of unshakable power and divine grace to the world outside. But, as we've seen, this polished exterior was maintained by a constant, churning engine of human drama and quiet struggle. The story of the empire isn't just written on the battlefield. It's whispered in the hallways of the palace. So far, we have witnessed the zenith of the Kanem-Bornu Empire under the formidable Idris Aluma. We saw an empire forged in strategy, faith, and innovation, a powerhouse of the Sahel. But, as history teaches us, even the mightiest structures are subject to the relentless passage of time. Today, we explore the long, slow twilight of this great empire. A story not just of decline, but of remarkable transformation and endurance. The death of a visionary leader like Idris Aluma often leaves a vacuum, and Kanem-Bornu was no exception. The unity he had painstakingly built began to fray. His successors, though part of his lineage, lacked his unique blend of military genius, diplomatic skill, and unwavering resolve. The court, once a center of strategic planning, became a stage for succession disputes. Brothers, cousins, and powerful nobles vied for the throne, and with each internal quarrel, the empire's foundations weakened just a little bit more. The centralized power that Aluma had established started to decentralize, with regional governors and vassals testing the limits of their autonomy. Simultaneously, the world around Kanem-Bornu was changing. The trans-Saharan trade routes, the very arteries that had pumped wealth and life into the empire, began to dwindle. New maritime routes, pioneered by European powers along the West African coast, offered a more direct and often cheaper alternative. Gold, salt, and other precious goods that once traversed the sands under the watchful eye of Kanem-Bornu's caravans now sailed the Atlantic. The city of Ngazargamu, once a bustling hub where merchants from Cairo to Timbuktu haggled and traded, saw its markets grow quieter. The flow of wealth slowed to a trickle, and with it the empire's ability to fund its vast army and administration. As if these economic and political challenges weren't enough, the very land seemed to turn against the empire. The Sahel, a region perpetually balanced on a knife's edge between sustenance and scarcity, entered a prolonged period of drought. Rains became unpredictable, then scarce. The fertile lands that fed the empires, cities, and armies began to parch and crack. Lake Chad, the lifeblood of the region, receded, its shores shrinking year by year. Pastures withered, and the great herds of horses that formed the core of the Kanem-Bornu cavalry began to perish from heat and hunger. The thundering charge of the armored knight, once the symbol of the empire's power, became a rarer and rarer sight. An army without its horses was like a ship without a sail. And what of the gunpowder? The divine advantage that had set Idris Aluma apart. It turned from a blessing into a burden. The firearms, the muskets and cannons that had once terrified their enemies were expensive to maintain. They required a constant supply of powder, lead, and skilled technicians, resources that were becoming increasingly scarce. What was once a symbol of imperial strength became a tempting prize for rivals and rebellious factions. The technology that had built the empire now contributed to its fragmentation, as smaller, well-armed groups challenged the central authority. The divine fire, once wielded by the Mai, was now in the hands of many, and its light no longer shone solely on the capital. The walls of Ngazargamu, which had stood as a testament to the empire's strength for centuries, began to show cracks. The once mighty state was besieged from within by strife, and from without by changing fortunes and a harsh climate. But an empire is more than its walls, its armies, or its trade routes. An empire is its people, and it was in the Kanuri people that the true spirit of Kanem-Bornu endured. Faced with the slow crumbling of the world, they knew. They did not simply despair. They adapted. This is perhaps the most incredible part of the story. When the trade caravans stopped coming, the traders did not starve. They picked up hoes and seeds, turning their hands to the earth. They became farmers, coaxing life from the arid soil, learning new techniques to conserve precious water, and planting resilient crops like millet and sorghum. The once sprawling pastures that fed war horses were repurposed to graze hardier livestock like goats and cattle, which could better withstand the dry conditions. The focus shifted from generating external wealth to ensuring internal survival. Community and cooperation became more valuable than gold. The soldiers, whose purpose had been tied to the expansion and defense of the state, found new roles. With fewer wars to fight and a diminished central command, they laid down their swords and became storytellers. They gathered the children under the shade of the baobab trees and recounted the glorious deeds of their ancestors. They spoke of the great maze, of the epic battles, and of the unwavering faith of Idris Aluma. Through their words, the history of the empire was not lost, but woven into the very fabric of the culture, passed down from one generation to the next, not as a dry list of dates, but as a living, breathing saga of their people. The grand palaces, once echoing with the commands of kings and the whispers of courtiers, fell silent. But they were not abandoned to ruin. Their spacious courtyards and sturdy walls were repurposed. They became schools, where the children of farmers and herders learned to read and write, not just from the Koran, but from the collected wisdom of their people. The pursuit of knowledge, a cornerstone of Aluma's reign, continued, transformed from an imperial project into a grassroots movement. The empire of the sword was becoming an empire of the mind, and in the quiet of the evening, as mothers rocked their children to sleep, the lullabies they sang carried the echoes of the past. They whispered the name of Idris Aluma, but the meaning had shifted. He was no longer just the great conqueror, the wielder of fire and steel. He became something more profound, a symbol of discipline, of the strength that comes from order and dedication, a symbol of faith, the unwavering belief in a higher purpose that can guide a person and a people through the darkest of times, and a symbol of unyielding purpose, the tenacity to keep going, to adapt, to survive, and to find a new way forward when the old one is gone. So let's pause here, one final time, as the sun sets over the Sahel. Imagine the ruins of a once great palace, bathed in the warm, orange light of dusk. See the children playing among the weathered stones, their laughter echoing where kings once held court. They carry wooden swords, not in preparation for war, but in a game that honors the memory of their ancestors, the storytellers and the soldiers. The story of Kanem-Bornu is not a simple tragedy of rise and fall. It is far more nuanced and, I think, far more inspiring. It is a story of transformation. It's the story of an empire that, like the deep wells its people dug to find water, or the resilient riders who crossed the endless desert, understood a fundamental truth, that endurance, in itself, is a form of prayer. It is an act of faith in the future, a testament to the indomitable spirit that refuses to be extinguished, even when the fires of empire have long since died down. The state may have vanished, but the nation the Canary people endured, carrying the legacy of Kanem-Bornu not in stone and gold, but in their hearts, their stories, and their children. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through time. The story of Kanem-Bornu reminds us that history is not just about empires, but about the resilience of the human spirit. Start with a slow, contemplative tone. Visuals of a crackling fire under a starry sky. The stars hang low over the Sahel now. Our fire burns small, and even the wind seems to hold its breath, listening. We've journeyed far, tracing the hoofprints of history across the vast, sun-scorched plains of Central Africa. We've walked through the ghost cities of Burni, Bazagamu, stood in the shadow of vanished fortresses, and listened to the echoes of a once mighty empire, Kanem-Bornu. We spoke of its origins, a whisper that grew into a roar on the shores of Lake Chad. We charted its expansion, its golden age of trade, learning, and military might under leaders who seemed larger than life. And at the heart of it all, we found one man, my Idris Aluma, the warrior king, the diplomat, the builder, the pilgrim. His reign was the zenith, the moment when all the threads of Kanem-Bornu's destiny were woven into a brilliant tapestry. He was a visionary, wasn't he? He saw the potential of firearms, bringing in Ottoman advisors to train a new kind of army. He didn't just conquer, he consolidated. He built brick fortresses, dug wells, and established a system of justice that brought a measure of peace to a turbulent land. His pilgrimage to Mecca was not just an act of faith. It was a masterstroke of international relations, connecting his Sahelian kingdom to the wider Islamic world, bringing back not just spiritual renewal, but also knowledge, technology, and prestige. Under his command, the Bornu cavalry became a legend. Imagine them, thousands of riders, their horses adorned in quilted armor, a thundering tide of steel and discipline sweeping across the savannah. They were the ultimate expression of the empire's power, enforcing the Mayes will from the Fezzan in the north to the lands of the House in the south. They were more than soldiers. They were the sinews of the state, the protectors of the trans-Saharan trade routes that were the empire's lifeblood. But empires, like all living things, have a lifespan. After Aluma, the story continues. But the brilliant peak gives way to a long, slow descent. Internal rivalries, the kind that Aluma had so skillfully managed, began to fester. The world outside was changing too. The trans-Saharan trade, once the source of immense wealth, began to dwindle as European powers forged new sea routes around Africa. The very foundation of Bornu's prosperity was eroding, like a sand dune in a storm. Then came the Sokoto Caliphate in the 19th century, a new, fervent power rising to the west. The jihad of Osman Dan Fodio presented a challenge that the aging empire struggled to meet. The old capital, Bindi Engazar, Gamu, the city of 100 gates, was sacked and abandoned. Though the Kanuri people rallied and a new capital was established, the old magic was gone. The world had moved on. The final blow came not from a rival empire, but from a warlord, Rabi, and soon after, the arrival of European colonial powers who drew lines on maps that carved the ancient empire into pieces. And so, the story of Kanem-Bornu, Idris Aluma, of the riders, the fortresses, the palaces seems to fade. But it doesn't fade into darkness. It fades into quiet, because history, like the desert, never truly ends. It only shifts. The shape of the dunes changes with the wind, but the sand remains, from dust to dust, from hoofbeat to heartbeat. And in that rhythm, Africa remembers. Look around. The same roads that Aluma's camel corps patrolled now host children chasing goats, traders on sputtering motorbikes, and pilgrims tracing invisible maps of faith and family. The same wells, once guarded by soldiers in iron helmets, now nourish villagers built from the very stones of their fallen forts. The legacy isn't in a throne or a crown. It's in the resilience of the people, in the language they speak, in the stories they tell their children. Every empire is a mirage, a shimmering vision of power that seems solid from a distance, but dissolves as you approach. Yet, every mirage holds a kernel of truth. The Bornu cavalrymen, the fortress guards, the palace poets, they lived, they bled, and they dreamed beneath these same stars. And though their armor has long since rusted away, their spirit of discipline, their legacy of a unified identity, became a legend that endures. Let's pause, just for one last moment, here by the fire. Listen, truly listen. Beyond the whisper of the wind and the crackle of the embers, do you hear it? A faint echo of hooves beneath the noise of the modern world, crossing centuries, carrying stories home. This has been our journey under baobab skies. Thank you for walking this path with us, for listening to the whispers of the past. If these stories have moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more tales waiting to be told beneath these ancient skies. Thank you for watching. You are now under baobab skies.